welcome. My name is Elena Vacchelli, and I'd like to welcome you to our third Impact for Beginners seminar, a collaboration between the Center for Applied Sociology Research and the Gender Deviance and Society Research Group. The aim of these seminars is bringing impact experts into dialogue with University of Greenwich staff. And we are excited to introduce today speaker Rob Davies. Rob is a knowledge mobilizer. What a great title at CLOSA. For those who don't know, CLOSA is an organization specializing in longitudinal research, and Rob's role is increasing visibility, use, and impact of longitudinal research within government and parliament. In other words, he's feeding evidence into policy and decision making. So today's seminar will focus on engaging with UK Parliament and government and how to mobilise research in the policy landscape. So we are recording this session and it will be available on the website of the Centre for Applied Sociology Research. So please, Rob, when you're ready.
Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me. I'm going to speak for about kind of 20 to 30 minutes about mobilising your research in the policy space. I'm going to talk about myself for a little bit and what I do, an approach that I find really useful that I'd recommend, some of the vehicles to mobilise your research, some of the live opportunities that exist now that you can mobilise your research through, and some of my kind of top tips, if you like, of kind of what to do. So I'm Rob Davies. I'm closest knowledge mobiliser, and for the past 12 months I've been a policy fellow in the House of Commons Scrutiny Unit in the Select Committee team. So in my fellowship, I'm helping to implement the Liaison Committee's recommendations on the use of research evidence by select committees, which has given me a pretty unique insight into this world. So I'll be kind of drawing on that experience today. And yeah, as you heard, CLOSA is a research centre. We're based at the UCL Social Research Institute. We're the partnership of leading social and biomedical longitudinal population studies, the UK Data Service and the British Library. And our fundamental role is to increase the visibility, use and impact of longitudinal population studies, data and research. And we're funded by the ESRC. So the ultimate aim of my role is to generate policy impact. So using scientific evidence to inform and influence policymakers. So a lot of my work centers around connecting people, building relationships and networks, looking for opportunities for our research to influence policy, and creating products and narratives to help influence the people in power and the decisions that they make. And some of the outcomes I seek to achieve are influencing policy development, shaping parliamentary legislation, and reframing policy debates. And policy impact in this context is all about generating change, basically. So it's using research evidence to generate a change in thinking or a change in approach. So it's all about change. But there's a fundamental challenge with this. So my first slide should probably be titled, "What really influences policy and decision makers?" And if we dig into what influences government ministers and members of parliament in particular, it's a far more complex picture than this often used phrase evidence-based policy making, which I've tried to capture in this graphic, in this image. So you see here that the scientific evidence is there, kind of in the middle, but it's part of a mix of elements that influence ministers and MPs. You have the priorities, which may come through a Queen's speech, relationships that these people have, affordability and timeframes, their personal, their political ambitions, and their own beliefs, and also public attitudes, media pressure, ideology, and emotions. So I created this slide not to depress you, but the point I want to make here is that scientific evidence is really important to remember that scientific evidence is only one part of this jigsaw. There are not only several factors involved, but some of these, and frustratingly from our perspective, often override evidence. So from the promises made in political party manifestos, as I said, to affordability, more often it's media pressure, kind of political timescales, these short-scale political timescales, emotions and values, and sometimes even anecdotes that are behind a policy direction or decision. So my next slide is a selection of quotes that I've collected over the past few years to highlight some of the specific challenges that we face in the research community when we're trying to generate policy impact from research. And as you can see here, first off, there's a member of parliament who is sick to death of getting briefings from academics that are full of jargon. Government advisor here saying that he's far more likely to be asked by a minister, government minister, to comment on a podcast or a blog or a media article, and rarely on an academic report. And my favorite quote of all time, which still rings true to this day, from a government official, that most day-to-day policy work rests on those twin pillars of Google and asking people that we know, or asking people that we trust. So I've picked these to illustrate a few key points, not just the challenge that we face in terms of generating policy impact, but the need to adapt your language for the target audience, to enhance academic papers with more accessible content, and the importance, if you think about kind of people that we know, the importance of trusted sources in the policy landscape, relationships in particular. So how do you use that knowledge to your advantage? So I'm going to talk you through an approach that I use each time I want to mobilise research in the policy landscape, and give you an example of how I use this technique during the pandemic to inform and influence policy and decision makers. So I'd like to introduce you to the taste, snack, feast, or what I find it easier to remember, the wedding cake approach. As you can see there, there's different layers there. So the taste, snack, feast model enables the people that you're trying to target, in this case, members of parliament, government ministers, to understand and engage with the content that's most suited to them. So whether it's their level of interest, their level of expertise, or the amount of time that they have. And you think of busy policymakers, busy MPs who don't have much time, that's particularly important. They just simply don't have the time to read masses of information. And what the wedding cake approach does is it creates a multi-layered portal into different expressions of a single narrative. So basically you've got the same narrative kind of going through all these different layers. And it helps you kind of think about it in this way and create a range of products in different ways and platforms to help maximize your impact. So you can see there, I've given examples of a taste is tweets and kind of infographics, you know, very visual, instant kind of impact to get your message across. A snack is more like a kind of briefing note, a very short kind of 2-page briefing note, or a blog. And again, if you think back to the the jigsaw of what influences policy, what really influences policy makers and decision makers, you're able to create a narrative. You're able to tell a story through a blog that you're not necessarily able to do through your research paper. And then the feast is the underlying research paper, or the data, the metadata that basically informs these products. So you have the research at the base, the feast, and then you express the narrative that you have, the messages that you have, whether it's recommendations or what you found in your research, through these different layers to help maximize your impact. Because fundamentally, it's not enough just to make research available. So decision makers, policy and decision makers, need to be properly targeted and evidence framed to motivate the recipient to make use of that evidence. So this approach encourages you to think about a package of outputs to enhance your research and really maximize your chances of cutting through the noise, getting noticed, and ultimately achieving policy impact, kind of generating that change that you want to do. So I'm just going to take you through an example of kind of how we did that, or how I did that. So can you believe it? 2 years ago, I can't believe it, quite frankly. 2 years ago, as the country, as the UK locked down in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, UK's population studies began to capture data on the experiences of their study participants and how the pandemic was affecting their lives. However, there was information on lots of different study websites. There were varying approaches to kind of data access across these studies. And there was a crowded field of, all of the studies of people, of academics, all trying to promote their work, understandably, through their own individual channels. And this meant that there was a real danger that vital insights, at a really important time when insights really needed to kind of cut through to policymakers and decision makers, for example, SAGE in this context, could be lost through kind of uncoordinated activity and the clamour of these individual studies to demonstrate the value and impact to their funders, which, as I said, is completely understandable. But when you think about, busy people who have no time, if they've got 20 different people coming at them with, different messages in different language, it's in different using different language, it's very difficult for that to kind of cut through. So what did I do? In May 2020, I created a made up, because it sounds good, COVID-19 task force. There was no money for this. We didn't get any funding, at the time. But it was basically to kind of create this construct to be able to kind of feed scientific evidence from the longitudinal population studies into policy making. So I brought together data, research, policy engagement, and communication specialists to kind of unify this disparate activity under one roof. So the aim of this work was to basically cut through the noise, present a coherent narrative to policy and decision makers, develop bespoke resources for researchers, make COVID-19 data from the studies more discoverable, and give a voice to the longitudinal research community. And you can see here in the graphic, this is just an example of what we had on the hub. So we had the surveys and the data collections here from all the studies. We created a research tracker, generated insights, and this is our discovery portal. So Close's narrative focused on three core messages that we wanted to land: the rapid response by UK longitudinal population studies to COVID-19, the value of the evidence from these studies in understanding the immediate and long-term impacts of the pandemic, and Close's response and how our work is adding value. So if you think back to the wedding cake, we created our own bespoke multi-layered portal, which we called the COVID-19 Longitudinal Research Hub. And this was to capture and showcase the response of our studies, but also to use as a platform to promote a range of outputs and activity for different audiences. So a lot of our focus was on increasing visibility of the studies and of the emerging evidence. And we utilize social media a lot to kind of maximize our chances of getting it noticed. So we developed resources in the form of a research tracker, bringing together all the research papers and other publications using data from our studies. And we synthesized research evidence to produce insights for policy and decision makers. And Close to Discovery, which is the UK's most detailed search engine for longitudinal data, included COVID-19 metadata across a range of policy relevant topics. So this is an illustration of basically how we utilize the wedding cake approach to maximize the chances of cutting through the noise. So you can see here on the left of your screen, we produce infographics summarizing research on specific topics of policy interest. In this case, it was the impact of education, which was clearly a huge issue in the country. And in terms of the policy context, the Education Select Committee was looking into, they launched an inquiry into the impact of COVID-19 on home education and what was happening. And here we did a bit of diagnosis of kind of what was happening, who was being affected the most, and what was needed, basically. We also produced, you see on the right here, policy briefing notes. So this is two-page, very short, very succinct, very clear language, kind of plain English language policy briefing notes with key findings and policy recommendations. And in the middle here is basically the illustration of the wedding cake approach. So it's different expressions of the same narrative: feast, snack, taste. So at the bottom here is our research tracker. So basically this is hundreds of research papers in our research tracker for researchers to kind of look into, policymakers, perhaps civil servants if they've got time. But then Same narrative, I wrote a blog, so utilizing narrative, being able to tell a story basically in different language. It's the same research papers, the evidence, I didn't produce any new evidence. I just summarized what was coming out of the studies, and did a blog which was featured in the Science in Parliament journal. And then same narrative as well for people who have got literally zero time. We produced a graphic, which you can see here, highlighting the main themes that were coming out of the research. So ethnicity, inequalities, mental health, well-being, epidemiology were the kind of most common themes that were coming out. But this is just an example to show you of this kind of same narrative going through the kind of different layers of the cake, but using different techniques to kind of maximize the chance of it getting noticed and kind of cutting through to policymakers. And I mentioned kind of social media. We supplemented this, this kind of approach with tweet threads each week, highlighting the new research added to the tracker. So again, very kind of short tweet threads saying this was the research, this is what it found, etc., etc. And this is just an example, a few examples and feedback from policymakers and parliamentarians. So you can see here the hub was featured in the DfE State of the Nation. We had some really nice feedback from a researcher at the Department of Health and Social Care, and a nice email from the chair of the Health and Social Select Committee in response to the briefings that I sent through, that they said would be helpful for the committee during future sessions. So that's an approach. So Taste, Snack, Feast is an approach that I find really valuable to communicating research evidence. Now I'm going to talk you through the vehicles that I found most useful to mobilise research in the policy landscape, and then talk through some examples of live opportunities. So opportunities now that you can mobilise your research. So first off, government. So in 2017, the first of the government department's areas of research interest, or ARIs, were published. Now, most departments have now published ARIs, and over the past few years, several have refreshed their original ARI publications. So what are they? So these documents outline the research areas that each department is interested in and where more evidence is needed, basically where their evidence gaps are. They contain kind of overarching themes, and then under each of these themes, specific research questions for academics to respond to. And if you have expertise and research that can help with the research questions in the ARIs, they really want to hear from you. And I'll say a bit more about ARIs a little bit later on. The second kind of primary vehicle is government green papers. So basically it's a fancy way of saying it's a consultation document. So they're consultation documents produced by the government, which ask for feedback on its kind of initial thinking, on its initial policy proposals. Now, in terms of how it goes in terms of legislation, basically you have a Queen's speech that the government kind of comes up with the main areas that it's going to legislate on. The main things it wants to do over the Parliament. That Queen's speech, the elements of that, the policy elements of that, then translate into a green paper, which is the consultation document. And then once they've had responses in, the government civil servants work that up into a white paper, which is basically the step before legislation, which then goes through the legislative process, which is complex, but that's the basic kind of fundamentals. But the best way for you to kind of engage with these and to surface your research evidence is at this green paper stage, at this consultation stage. So turning to Parliament, there are various ways to mobilise your research and generate policy impact. And the vehicles, as I said, there's various ways, but the vehicles I've listed here will give you the best return on your investment. So I'll say a little bit more about each a little bit later, but very briefly, Parliamentary Select Committees. So they hold inquiries on a range of matters, from the conduct of government to specialist subject areas. And they really, really want to hear from academics and researchers, particularly early career researchers. They're really keen on kind of getting out of their usual suspects bubble and hearing a diverse range of voices from the research community. So it's really, really key to respond to their calls for evidence. There's the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So House of Commons committees mainly focus on government departments. So they scrutinise the government departments and their work. The House of Lords committees are slightly different. And for our purposes, they often have special committees that look into a specific topic, which are often open for the call for evidence is open for a lot longer than the House of Commons committees. They're more used to, if you know anything about the Lords committees, the Science and Technology Committee, for example, is in the House of Lords is made up of Royal Society fellows, ex-chairs of Wellcome, etc., etc. You know, these are people who know what they're talking about. Slightly different in the House of Commons. But what we found over the past kind of few years with House of Lords committees in terms of their specific topics is they're a really helpful vehicle and often geared towards research evidence. That enable you to kind of mobilise your research. So one of the ones that I worked on a couple of years ago was gambling behaviour and harms. And there's new Lords committees on public services and on adult social care as well, which have inquiries which are kind of open at the moment and keen to hear evidence from academics about their research in those areas. So ARIs, I mentioned areas of research interest in government. ARIs in Parliament are a relatively new thing. It's actually one of the projects that I've been leading on during my policy fellowship, which I can say more about in the Q&A if you like. But whilst they're a new thing, they are designed for and specifically targeted at researchers. So they're an emerging and kind of really important mechanism for mobilising research. Now I'll get into a little bit more detail on those in a bit. The fourth one, post notes. So a post note is a 4-page briefing note reviewing emerging areas of research produced by the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, or POST for short. And there are regular opportunities to contribute to these as a researcher if you have research related to the topic, or act as an external reviewer as well. And these are 2 ways of being able to kind of demonstrate policy impact. And finally, APPGs, or all party parliamentary groups. So these aren't select committees, they're informal groups of MPs and peers, which are focused on either subjects or countries. And it's the subjects one that we're most interested in. They look into a range of subjects. There's an APPG on bowling, an APPG on horses, an APPG on wine. Yeah, that's a good one to be a member of, particularly given the wine cellar that's in Parliament. But there are also, crucially from our perspective, there's an APPG on health, for example, on life sciences, on osteoporosis, on various, very specific research topics. When I first started working, in kind of, in and around kind of Parliament and government 20 years ago. So about 20 years ago, APPGs were a bit of a club. It was just kind of MPs coming together, with an interest in a subject, what have you. If you think of a country APPG, don't tell anyone this, but it was often, to get a, fact-finding trip to Barbados, for example. Whereas now there are many APPGs that actually call for evidence to inform their discussions, and they produce reports. And they're a much more informal way to engage with parliamentarians and mobilise your research than perhaps a select committee inquiry, which is a very formal way, formal mechanism, or a post note. So yeah, these are the ways. Like I said, there are many ways. There's also, I understand, there's Welsh Parliament and government, Scottish Parliament and government, but they have similar things. They have select committee inquiries. They have entities like Post that produce evidence briefings, which again, you have kind of the opportunities to contribute to review in. But yeah, these are the primary vehicles. These will give you the best return on investment. So moving on. So I said I was going to give you some live examples of where you can mobilise your research. So first, government ARIs. So here on the left is a screenshot from the collection of government department ARIs. You can see it was in response to the nurse review. And crucially, they're trying to generate a more sophisticated dialogue with academia, align scientific research evidence from academia with policy development, engage with researchers, access stronger policy evidence, a better value for money. On the right-hand side here, this is a screenshot of the DFT, the Department for Transport's ARI, which was published, I think, at the end of last year, but is still very much live. So you can see there, the kind of broad purpose, which is basically engaging with academics and filling knowledge gaps. But you can see here also the scope. There's a vast number of topics here, each with, if you get into the document, each with individual research questions, highlighting the evidence gaps and where more research is needed. So it's a really, really, it's quite an easy way, I would say, of kind of, engaging with a department, and starting up that conversation, building relationship, and mobilizing your research in the policy domain. And they're very open. There's contact details within each of these ARIs for each of the teams in the department. And believe me, they are very, very keen to hear from you if you've got research evidence. And I know there's various exercises happening now to refresh a number of the ARIs. So it's one thing to kind of keep an eye on in the future, particularly if you're researching in transport or health or justice, for example. So next, I mentioned parliamentary AIIs. So as I said, it's one of the topics that one of the projects, that I've been working on. So we've been trialing select committee AIIs as a pilot exercise to try and better understand and assess how they can support parliamentary scrutiny. So there's 3 AIIs, managed 3 AIIs, one for the International Development Committee and one for the International Trade Committee. That was last year. They're now closed. But last week, we launched the first joint ARI. The Women and Equalities Committee and Home Affairs Committee have published an area of research interests focusing on violence against women and girls to help their scrutiny in this area. And we've broken down, there's, I think, about 6 kind of different topics: prevalence, kind of impact of early intervention, availability of interventions, to help focus the responses from the research community. But as you can see there, I've created a survey. So there's a survey, a very basic survey that comes with it. And academics at all career stages are encouraged to register their interest in the ARI, add any existing research that you have in the topic areas to the repository and provide insights. And crucially, and this is quite a new thing, suggest scrutiny questions that the committee could be asking the government. And that's one of the things, if you ever submit written evidence to a select committee, that adding that extra element to your submission, so not just kind of diagnosis and perhaps recommendations, but saying actually there are these areas that are missed, or you need to ask this question to the government because this is something that needs to be looked into. And the committees are very open to that and very welcoming to that. And a recent example, I did a written submission to the Health and Social Care Committee on body image, and that was just summarising the evidence from the studies. And as part of that, suggested some scrutiny questions, and they asked one of the scrutiny questions in their first evidence session, which was great to see. Which is, it's not huge impact, but you can kind of see your influence kind of coming through, which is really, really great. And yeah, I'll provide links. Just to say, I should have said at the beginning, I'm happy to share my slides, and there's hyperlinks to all of this in each slide, so you don't have to kind of find them yourselves. So yeah, that's select committee ARIs, new, but definitely there'll be more coming, so keep an eye out there. And finally, this is just an example. So here on the left, this is a snapshot of currently open House of Commons select committee inquiries. And again, you can see there, criminal justice system, journalism, science and tech strategy, and drug policy as well. Again, a huge range of topics that enable you to kind of mobilize your research and engage with them. And then on the right here, this is post. I mentioned post notes earlier. So there are more than these on the stocks, but this is just, again, to give you an example of the various ways and the topics that they're interested in. And they are, as I said, very, very interested and keen to hear from academics. And yeah, it's a very straightforward and quite easy way of getting your research in front of policymakers. Post is a very trusted entity within Parliament. All MPs and peers and their staff read post notes. They're considered a go-to resource. So if your evidence is in that, and your name or research is in that, then you're far more likely to get impact and potentially be called maybe to give evidence or to have a conversation about your research. So I just wanted to finish with a few key areas, or the key areas actually, I should say, to focus on to help mobilise your research and generate policy impact. So first off, policy impact should never be an add-on. So to give you the best opportunity to influence policy and decision makers, you really need to embed impact at the start and across the life course of your research. So you remember I was talking about policy impact is all about change. So think about the change you want to happen and how and where you're going to mobilise your research really early on in your planning process. And hopefully I've given you a few examples, a few vehicles of where you can do that. Increasing your awareness and understanding of the world that you're trying to influence will definitely help you maximise your impact. Government departments are really hard to penetrate, and to an outsider, Parliament can often seem like an alien world. But you can take a shortcut with the latter by engaging with the excellent resources and guidance that Parliament's Knowledge Exchange Unit produce on how you can make an impact with your research in Parliament. And for the former, my advice, again, is to check out the Government Department AIIs for insights into where you can mobilise your research, where they need more research evidence. It's also key to remember that government is not the same as Parliament. So at a fundamental level, the government runs public departments and proposes new laws to Parliament. Parliament has a scrutiny role. Parliament scrutinises government policy and holds the government to account. So their roles are very different and require different approaches. An example of that, which has particularly come to the fore with my experience in during the policy fellowship, is that government departments have huge resources and a lot more resource than select committees. So it's really worth being aware of this, and particularly when you're engaging with select committees, remembering that often there's perhaps only one or two members of staff that are actually managing a range of select committee inquiries. So they really don't have the time, and this is why it's often it's often helpful to think about it that way, and to make it as easy as possible for parliamentary staff, for select committee staff, to engage with the product, with the evidence that you're submitting. It's also really important to build up a network beyond the academic research community bubble. So one of the best ways I found to do this is by attending policy-focused events. There are lots of these happening. Institute for Government, think tanks as well hold these events where they bring in parliamentarians or policymakers and talk about a topic. And doing this, attending these, it helps you to become more attuned to the audience that you're aiming to influence. So the issues that they're interested in, what motivates them, and the language they use. Thinking about immersion in terms of learning a language, it's similar to that you really start to get attuned of what they're looking for and where you can mobilise your evidence, and to who as well. And it can also really help with visibility as well. There are many examples of where an academic has said, "Oh, I attended, a policy exchange or an event held by a think tank, and they were talking about something related to my research. I asked a question. I said, I'm looking at this. What do you think about X, Y, and Z?" And the next thing they know, they get an email from a civil servant saying, "Oh, hi, I saw your question. Great question, and saw your research. Would you mind coming in and giving a presentation to the department?" because we're really interested in that. So again, it's about visibility, not just getting attuned to the audience and understanding, who you're trying to target, but also raising your visibility as well. And then the final kind of points, your research needs to be accessible. So the people you're trying to communicate with don't occupy our world. So they have a different culture, they speak a different language, and never ever want to hear the words more research is needed when they're looking for practical policy recommendations that they can implement in a political cycle, if you think back to that jigsaw again. So to cut through, basically you need to adapt your language. So in a nutshell, it means jargon-free, plainly written, focused on solutions rather than just diagnosing a problem. Now, I'm not saying don't diagnose the problem, but that, quite often, particularly with government, they're more interested on kind of solutions, what's working, what's not working, and what should be done because of that, rather than just the kind of the diagnosis. And I found the most effective way to get your message across is to combine scientific evidence with compelling stories and case studies to emphasize that kind of real world context. And even better is to use visuals and infographics to increase the chances of it getting noticed. When you think back to kind of, busy people who are just being bombarded by, briefings upon briefings, they're far more likely to kind of engage with and see a kind of visual or a very powerful infographic than they are definitely an academic research paper, perhaps even a blog. And fundamentally, you and your research needs to be discoverable. So it's really, really important to increase your visibility so that policy and decision makers can find you. And this means getting involved. So regardless of, leave aside your kind of imposter syndrome, and we all have it, but you're an expert in your chosen field compared to those you're trying to influence. So sign up to the expert databases, engage with the scrutiny process by submitting written evidence to select committee inquiries, write blogs about your research, and make yourself and your research visible to those who you want to influence on their preferred social media platform. Hint, it's Twitter. And I know that there are some people that have issues with Twitter, but this is, policymakers, MPs, think tanks, they are all on Twitter. They use that as their primary vehicle to kind of engage and find out who's doing what in various areas. So if you really want to be seen, you've got to utilize that platform. And I think finally, it's really important to remember that generating policy impact takes time. So for you as a researcher, focusing on your visibility, building relationships and networks, and producing digestible content using accessible language will help you cut through. But I appreciate, I do this for a living, so that's a lot to ask. So if you do one thing and only one thing, focus on your visibility of you as an expert and of your research. And I just wanted to finish off, like I said, I'll share them, but we produced a module. We've got a closer learning hub on communicating research, which has a bit more about the wedding cake approach and some other kind of helpful advice. If you want to find out a little bit more of what I've been doing in Parliament, I did wrote a case study, but I think more importantly for this audience, did a podcast, which with Dr. Fatin Hussain, who I've been working with. She's a senior specialist in the Select Committee team. That I've been working with during my fellowship, with some kind of other tips and hints of how to engage with Parliament. And I mentioned the knowledge exchange unit. There's some really, really helpful online training videos for early career researchers, mid-career researchers, knowledge mobilizers, for the whole, the entire kind of research community. They're about 30 minutes each, so kind of really digestible, which I highly recommend. You check out. So that's it from me. I hope that was helpful. I'll stop presenting.
Thanks, Rob. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
cool. So I was just thinking back about how often academics tend to be really hypercritical about the kind of research into policy space, because I don't know, academics just tend to be hypercritical of everything. And then obviously the way you put it, it's like, well, actually there are all these different opportunities and resources that you can engage with, and you don't have to do it all, and you don't have to do it all at once, but these are there. And I think many of us don't realize or I don't know, we feel disgruntled because we see kind of, and sometimes we confuse government and parliament as well. Yeah, that happens a lot.
It's incredibly common. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I've got a comment from Lynn in relation to the taste part of the cake and avoiding Twitter, or so their curiosity is, how do you get your tweets noticed by policymakers? Do you tag certain individuals?
I do sometimes. So that does work. Yeah, I have found that works. I think that the way to think about it is it's not, you're not just using Twitter basically to try and get their attention. So it's thinking about, using a variety of mechanisms. So, if it's the one thing that you can do, a tweet thread on your research paper, what you found, recommendations, and try and employ hashtags as well, I think there. So, if it's social care, for example, hashtag social care, mental health, hashtag mental health. Because quite often, I think civil servants, in particular, not necessarily staff in Parliament, because they just don't have the time, but civil servants do check Twitter. They search and kind of see, which academics kind of, what the conversations are around a particular topic area. But to get, to maximize your opportunity, you need to find different ways of kind of expressing that narrative. So yes, Twitter, but also kind of blogs. Try and use an infographic as well, and tweet that out as well. On infographics, you don't have to be, I'm nowhere near an expert. I use Canva. We all use Canva. You can get, you can pay for it, but there's a free version which is really easy to use. I think if I can use it, then anyone can use it. I think the education graphic was used on Canva. Again, very, very simple. The key thing is getting your narrative right, the kind of key messages, adapting your audience. But yeah, I understand some people have a kind of real understandable kind of avoidance of Twitter. But I think just thinking about, kind of targeting it towards your audience, and as you say, kind of tagging people, MPs, journalists. I think tagging journalists is actually a really helpful thing to do, because journalists are far more, again, that's their, their primary platform. Journalists are far more likely to pick it up than an individual MP, perhaps, particularly if they're really interested in that topic. But it's really important it's that package, thinking about a kind of package of activity.
Yeah, so thank you. We've got a comment from Sally just saying, loving the cake metaphor. And without knowing it explicitly, her last research project did the same, having the 3 tiers, but not yet the graphics or poster format. So something to think about.
That's great, Sally.
I think, yeah, as you said, a lot of people get put off by like, oh, do I have to become an expert in graphic design? But actually, yeah, you can use Canva. There are kind of easy tools at our disposal to be able to do things, and maybe turn them around quite quickly. I think one thing that struck me about your initial story was when you talked about how during the COVID crisis at the beginning, there was so many different voices, and it was like a cacophony of sounds, and nobody knew who to listen to or who to go to. So I'm wondering, and I think in part this also comes from like the frustration of academics not being heard, and therefore kind of wanting to kind of put their voices and their ideas out there, and B, also the fact that often in academia we work alone. We work in we're very in individualized and individualistic silos, and so it's hard for us to kind of come together in a moment of crisis and just be like, let's just have a unified message that we all want to put across. So that really struck me as something that is important, particularly. So, would you say like would you say being involved in it and trying to create more networks or clusters is useful? Or
yeah, definitely, but also in terms of the policy world as well. So kind of building up relationships. One of the reasons I'm very effective is, I have the advantage of I've worked in government and Parliament before, so yeah, there's obviously an advantage there, and I do this for a living. But one of the main thing that I focus on is building relationships and trust. So when, for example, something like the COVID pandemic, comes about, people are coming to me. People are thinking, how do I get a sensible you know, kind of response from somebody to tell me what's going on. And obviously, I'm not the only person. Obviously, there are many people that they kind of call on. But it's trying to get yourself into that position, which you can do as an individual academic, also as a group as well. A group is far more powerful, I think, because you've got a lot more evidence to kind of draw on and a lot more skills there. It gives you that, you know, a bit more kind of authority, if you like. Yeah, it's building the relationships also in the policy network, building the relationships with Post, for example. So when they think, oh, we've got these MPs, you know, or the Post board is really interested in, you know, this, you know, topic X, and then you go, actually, yeah, we know, you know, Julia, you know, because she's looking into, you know, she's looking into this, and let's give her a call. And it's those relationships and kind of, you know, it's that the legwork that you do at the beginning means that when these things come along, when these crises or whatever come along, that you're far more likely to not just be approached, but to be kind of trusted and to kind of be able to kind of cut through. So as I said, it takes time. You know, these things don't happen overnight. You've got to work on it, but it's not a huge amount of work. You know, I'm not saying, you know, every day you have to go to a kind of policy, you know, event. You know, once a month is probably more than enough. You know, it could be very picky and kind of targeted to kind of what, you know, towards what you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say, firstly, thank you so much. I took pages and pages of notes. I have a question with regards to, well, it's really commendable what you're trying to do, so using research to inform policy. But I wonder, and my research is, my actually question is slightly different, because my area of expertise is migration, so I'm familiar with the one particular review on migration, which was highly criticized for not using evidence-based at all. In fact, it quoted, and I'm talking about the Casey review.
Yeah.
It was talking, you know, it was just referencing other parliamentary speeches and you know, it wasn't evidence-based at all. So I was wondering, how does that happen? Because from what you say, it sounds like there's a lot of attention in integrating evidence-based into policymaking.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's only really, I would say, over the last kind of couple of years that this has actually started coming to the fore. So in kind of historical terms, you're absolutely right, and you know, it's actually one of the reasons there are, you know, a number of examples like that which were a kind of driver towards government departments being more explicit and kind of opening up a little bit more and trying to get more academic evidence in. Your example, and this I find, you know, very common, is this kind of usual suspects. So that, you know, people who don't have time, and it's those kind of trusted resources, whether in this case it's kind of parliamentarians or, you know, things that they know that they can kind of draw on, and that's where they go, and that's why it comes back to the kind of, you know, the visibility aspect and you know, kind of creating different products to kind of cut through really helps. But I would say it's still, you know, it's still not there. You know, AIIs, for example, in Parliament are a very new thing. You know, it's only over the past you know, kind of 12 months really that Parliament have started to try and, you know, really think about how do we open ourselves up, make ourselves more accessible, in particular to the research community, because we have these major gaps that we're just not filling by, you know, for example, charities or, you know, government, you know, evidence, you know, government reports and things like that. So yeah, there are positive. Yeah, it's not. I don't think that, you know, we're kind of there yet. But I think there are kind of more positive tones kind of coming out from both government and Parliament. But you're right that there are a number of examples. You know, I read a report and just think, even I'm not an expert in this. Even I know academics just at UCL who are looking into this, who you should have drawn on. But yeah, it's you know, the criticism is absolutely right. But I would say that there's a lot that we can do in our community, in the research community, to kind of help them find us as well. And that kind of discoverability is a really kind of key thing. And if you're, you know, if it's almost kind of in their face, if you know, different people are saying, oh, look, I saw this really interesting infographic, and, you know, and, well, actually, I read a blog about it, and, you know, well, here's this, yeah, I was sent this summary of this research paper. It's the wedding cake. It's the same thing, but just different expressions, and landing it with different kind of places to try and maximize. It doesn't work all the time, but just maximize your opportunity of kind of cutting through and then saying, well, actually, let's draw on this evidence, or let's have a rapid evidence review roundtable, or kind of things like that, which is bit more common now with government departments than it used to be kind of a few years ago.
Brilliant, thank you. That's really refreshing to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, getting away from the usual suspects as well, because we need some fresh people in the mix.
Yeah, well, there's a just on that, in Parliament, well, actually in government as well, but particularly in Parliament. I don't think, I'm not sure if it's published, but it doesn't matter, to be honest with you. So the select committees have a kind of they have objectives. So they have an objective to increase the range of voices that they hear from academia. So they're really keen. Quite more often than not, particularly in the past, it's been senior professors, and to be quite frank, it's been male, pale, and stale. Really dominated by these male professors. Exactly. But they're really keen to get kind of new voices in, and that's one of the reasons of producing the AIIs, to try and make it not just easier but a bit more informal, of trying to ECRs being able to say, who don't necessarily see themselves as an expert, I would, but they don't necessarily see themselves, to say, well, actually all you need to do is register, say what you're looking into, put your research paper or even your PhD or what have you there, summarize it, suggest some areas that the select committee could look into, and that's it. You don't have to do this kind of big formal response to a committee, which takes a long, takes me a long time as well to kind of do these things, let alone if you're not used to it. I just want to emphasize the point that if you're an early career researcher, do look out for these opportunities, because I think especially now, use this knowledge to your advantage. They want to hear from ECRs. If you're an ECR, engage, because at this point you're far more likely to be contacted than some years ago.
Thank you. Tanya's got a question about opportunities for systematic reviews to address the kind of existing knowledge gap or kind of research questions that are out there that of, I guess, from ARI or POST or other opportunities that you talked about, and also whether you know of any funding opportunities that accompany these.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, there's definitely opportunities for systematic reviews. I think I do a lot of evidence synthesis. I'm not doing my I'm not doing I'm not doing my own research. I'm drawing together evidence, and it's one of the things that parliamentarians and government as well, to be honest with you, government officials appreciate the most. They often say, do not send us one paper, something that's based on one paper. We just can't use it. But a systematic review based on however many studies, that's an incredibly powerful product. And if you can then kind of enhance it, supplement it with adapt your language, thinking about the wedding cake approach, using different products, infographics or blogs, etc., to kind of enhance that even more so. So I'd say definitely that. In terms of opportunities, it's a great question. So I think in terms of funding, looking at the AIIs, so one of the important things is becoming even more important, particularly with UKRI and ESRC, is centering your research proposal, your funding proposal in the policy landscape. So being able to say, we want to look into this, this aspect, and it's actually meeting an existing evidence need. Department for Transport say they don't have enough evidence on active transport, for example, active travel, and we want to do this. I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but you're far more likely to be successful in your funding opportunity than just saying we're interested in this and we want to kind of investigate this. So it's kind of thinking of it, centering it within that. It's about the relevance of your research, so centering it within the kind of policy landscape, the demand from Parliament, parliamentarians, or the demand from government departments, and that helps to make the argument, particularly to funders. There's a recent example of that. So International Trade Committee, AIIs, the ESRC, kind of one of the priorities for the ESRC, and they funded, this wasn't direct, more of a correlation than causation, but the ESRC said that the International Trade Committee AIIs and the kind of that demand there was definitely a kind of helped them look at the funding proposals for new Centre for Trade and kind of help those kind of get over the line. So kind of really kind of centering it within that is definitely helpful. In terms of kind of actual opportunities, I think there are strategic priority funds, there are kind of knowledge exchange. It depends on your university. UCL has kind of pots here and there for knowledge exchange activities. So it's definitely worth kind of investigating if your university has that. And again, centering it within the, we're bringing together academics to, look at, as a DFT again, the DFT's ARIs, and to tease out the evidence, and then producing a product or a range of products at the end, which then you send to, DFT and say, we've done this exercise, is again, really powerful and makes it much more likely that you're going to kind of cut through.
Yeah, great. I mean, knowledge exchange is all the rage at the moment. It's also a massive part of our new strategy at the University of Greenwich. I'm going to take one last question from Fiorella, which is, sometimes research findings might point to areas that critique the approach of certain government departments. Do you have any experience and examples of how to channel such criticisms and still drive policy change?
Yeah, it's a good one. I think kind of turning it on its head, you think about Parliament and its scrutiny role, so select committees in the scrutiny role, those kind of research findings would be absolutely perfect for a select committee. So saying, this is the critique, this is what is going wrong, this is what needs to happen, and you need to ask the government what they're doing on kind of X, Y, and Z. So for me, that's a clear example of where you can use that use that evidence and affect change. In terms of government department, I think it does depend on relationships. So I think doing a long Twitter thread kind of castigating the government isn't necessarily the most kind of tactful kind of way to go about that. You may get some impact with that, but not necessarily going to make lots of friends in whatever government department it is. So I would say if you're looking to target a government department, it's the relationship aspect. So it's being contacting somebody and having an informal discussion with them, instead of the kind of taking the stick kind of route, and also helping them as well. So I think often I provide a lot of help. Again, that's one of the reasons that I'm quite successful, is I do things for them. I say, oh no, don't worry about it. I'll do some evidences. I'll speak to my the research community, and I'll pull that together. And that when you start doing this, you're far more likely to kind of build this constructive, I would say, relationship. Not I'm not saying it's positive or negative, but it's a very constructive relationship, which you can be kind of open with them. But yeah, specifically, if you've got that, then yeah, find the select committee, and even if they're not doing an inquiry on it at the moment. So one of the things I didn't say, they're always looking. Select committees are always kind of scoping for new inquiries. So if there's something that you think is going wrong in a government department, then write to a select committee chair, copy the clerk in as well, and just pop it over in an email, because that would be incredibly useful. Yeah,
very good advice. Thanks, Rob. Thank you so much. I think this has been a really fantastic and really insightful session, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us.
Not at all. Thanks for having me, and great questions, everyone. Really enjoyed the challenge and the questions. And as I said, I'll share. I'll stick all the hyperlinks in and share them with you to share around, so you can find all of the various bits and bobs.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well, great stuff. Have a lovely
Thank you.
Yeah. Not
Take care, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for coming. Take care.
Thanks everyone.